another session for needs analysis. So today we're going to talk about the 4 approaches to needs analysis or needs assessment. If you recall from the readings on your book for this class, we have 5, except I might have mentioned before that we are going to focus primarily on 4 because the complex is, given that it's complex, you can go 2 ways about it. You either mix 2 of these 4, or it makes it anything outside of these 4 approaches. So that's the reason why we're going to leave it out. But let's go ahead and dive into the very first one, the knowledge and skills assessment, which, as the name recalls or points out, is focusing on the knowledge of a person that is needed to perform a job. Also, it talks about the skills. And if you recall, the skills are those traits that we acquire either in school or in trade school or while we are learning a craft. And so the idea of this knowledge and skills assessment is precisely to go at the person level and figure out what it is that a person or a group of people need to know to perform a job, whether it's a knowledge base or a set of skills. The second one is the job and task analysis. So at this point, we're no longer talking about people. At this point, we're looking at precisely a job or a task. So what it is that is needed to get a job done. I usually like to talk about the forklift example. A forklift is a tool that helps someone do the job of moving bulk or bulky items in a warehouse or the like. So the job is the moving, and we need the tools, we need the person or the people, and that person or people have to have the skills, etc. And then of course you have the task, which is sometimes the stacking bulk in that warehouse, or parking the forklift, or closing the warehouse, or the like. The third one is the competency-based needs assessment. And so at this point, we start talking about a combination of the two. When a person has the knowledge and the skills to perform a job or a task, at that point we figure out at what level of proficiency are they doing, and that's where the competency gets into. We can have competency, for example, thinking about the soccer game. Think about the goalie, a person that knows the rules of the game and has the skill to put the uniform and play football, or let's actually switch to soccer. And I'll have another analogy for that. So if you think about soccer, the job is for the goalie to stop the ball from getting into the net. Their task varies. They have several tasks. One to pass the ball, another one to kick the ball at to the players, another one is to stop the ball from coming in, and so on and so forth. The competency is the ability and the level of effectiveness in which they stop the ball from getting into the net. The competency also lies in the way they kick the ball so that it can be passed to a team player rather than the competition. And then the last one is the strategic needs assessment. And so at that point, we step away from the competency and we talk about what do we need to go from one level of execution to another at a company or at a department. So if you think about it progressively, we went from 1 through 4, where we are talking about a person, the job or the task they do, the competency or the accuracy in which they do it, to what the business is trying to do. So if you think about it, those are the 4 different approaches. And the reason why we look at these 4 technically is twofold. The first one on the screen, as you can see, we have to think about the time and the labor. So when we are conducting the knowledge and skills assessment, very little time, very little labor to do. When we get into the second one, the time increases, as does the labor to get that analysis. When we get all the way to the fourth approach, which is the strategic needs assessment, it is going to take us longer, plus it is going to take more effort. There's more labor involved. So on the subsequent slides, we'll talk a little bit about why that is. So let's dive into the knowledge and skills assessment. So we're going to part ways from the soccer player example that I used before to talk about JC. So he works as an analyst for a company, and one of his primary jobs is to identify central tendency measures, things like the mean, the mode, the median. Think about that knowledge and those set of skills that are needed to be an analyst. That helps us get an idea of what the needs analysis is going after. The reason why we need to do that is because usually in a company, we need to perform that needs analysis before launching any kind of training, any kind of development initiative, because we may be beating the dead horse, as some people say. So we have to run that needs analysis. Find what we're doing today, what the knowledge and the skills are, and where we want them to be. So once we have done that, we can determine what is the best solution, which in some cases, for those of you who are in the learning and development arena, know that not everything is solved with learning and development. So one of the things that we want to do with the needs analysis when we're talking about knowledge and skills is figure out that performance gap. So if a person is doing the means calculation of analysis, of data, and they are not doing it well because they are making too many mistakes, etc. At that point, we know that there is a gap, so we need to do a needs analysis. So we use this particular approach, the knowledge and skills, usually when we have new opportunities of business. If the company, say, is opening a new department, a new division, there is a new tool, a new technology, a new platform, and at the same time, there are changes to platforms. There are people that are now being promoted, and so they have new responsibilities. However, they weren't originally hired to do certain responsibilities. So while they probably have expanded their expertise, that does not necessarily mean that they know it all. So that's where the knowledge and skills can potentially come into play a role. Similar to jobs upgrades, and then when we need to right size the organization, we sometimes decide that we need to prepare people to do something different, right? And so the benefits of running a KNS, or a knowledge and skills assessment, is that it helps us ensure that the training programs or any development is identified and we are targeting that specifically. So the company is not spinning their wheels training on something that is not going to give them any benefit. It's usually easy to implement, and the biggest challenge is the lack of detail that we get, because a lot of it is self-reported data. When you're asking somebody how they are doing something, you are trusting that they tell you exactly what they're doing and how well they're doing it, right? Or how much they know something, or how well their skill is being performed. Success factors for these knowledge and skills. Definitely we need to have support from the senior officials or the management, upper management. We have to have buy-in from some interest groups. If there is, for example, a union or some group like that, we definitely need to make sure that they are okay with those type of analysis. And then the fact that we can collect data from people directly, because they are the ones who are having the knowledge and the skills. So there are steps for implementing the knowledge and skills assessment. We definitely have to gather the preliminary data, which usually is what we do anyway. We ask questions, we jot some details down, try to determine that point A, point B, and the gap. Then we map out a plan. How long is it going to take us to do that? What type of information do we need? Whom do we need it from? How we are going to collect it? How we are going to analyze it? And then, of course, prepare and present our findings via a report. So some guidelines that we have included in this deck here is we have to adapt or modify the strategy based on the situation, because you're not going to always be able to run a knowledge and skills, say, at a manufacturing setting compared to an office setting. So you have to be very flexible about it. Then the data collection process needs to be facilitated in such a way that we sometimes don't need to go collect data that already is collected somewhere else. So we have to be very mindful in asking the client what they have used to determine that they have a need. And so usually if they say that they have trends or they have observations, etc., that's data that we can use already. And then of course we have to limit the size or the group from which the information is going to be obtained, because if we say are going to tackle a needs analysis on knowledge and skills of a company that has 50,000 people, you can imagine how long that's going to take. So you have to be careful whom you decide to collect data for this analysis. Of course, it's got to be relevant. The second one is the job and task analysis. And if you remember, I was talking about it's no longer the person necessarily. So let's go back to JC, our friend here. He is tasked with identifying central tendency measures, as we talked about in the past, but it has to be done accurately and quickly. He's expected to use standard tools from the Microsoft Office suite, which we know is Excel. So at this point, the job and task analysis is going to lead us to figure out how we are going to evaluate the way in which that job is being performed. The analysis that he's performing has to come from reports, and then we have to make sure that the work itself is getting done right. So the task analysis, as you can see on the job analysis, on the task analysis is the method for determining the knowledge, the skills, the tools, the conditions, and the requirements that are needed to perform the job that JC has been tasked with doing. And so the job and task analysis, when we put it together, helps us gather the information about the scope, the responsibilities, and the task for this function that the person or the group of people are being asked to perform. Some of the benefits definitely are the buy-in. People believe that because they are being asked, they are being taken into consideration around what the solution may be. The performance definitely helps us figure out kind of like an outline, if you will, that are needed to be competent doing a job or performing a task. It helps us classify sometimes. So when we perform a needs analysis around the job or task analysis, we can then classify this is a level 1 job, this is an assembly job, this is a analysis job, etc. So we can classify that way. And then of course sometimes it does help define benchmarks. The benchmarks are useful in a company usually when you want to measure performance. So once you have those benchmarks, you know how well something needs to be done, how long does it take to do, etc. So that's usually very helpful. Some of the drawbacks around the job and task analysis are that environmentally, we don't include those external factors. So we can do the job, but what about the environment? If the job needs to be done outside and there is poor weather, we don't evaluate that necessarily. We don't assess it. So that's external. Cultural also is a factor because it does not get into the cross-cultural elements in some jobs, especially now that we are becoming so diverse in cultures, so rich in cultures across the world, really. That's one of those factors that is not usually accounted for, so we have to either build it in or do a separate needs analysis. And then also another thing that is not accounting for in the job and task analysis is the resources. We need a lot of commitment and time, money to be observing. For example, if you have to evaluate how a job is done in an assembly line, think about the number of instances that a unit is going to have to be produced, assembled, or disassembled to perform your needs analysis. So that's where it starts to become really, really challenging. Some success factors for the job and task analysis, definitely we need the support. We need those resources, as I was talking about, the time and the money. As far as the stability, we have to go and evaluate something that usually is consistently done well, or is done time and time again in a similar manner. If it always fluctuates in terms of how it's done, then we cannot really assess it well. And then of course there has to be open communication for people to say exactly what's happening. As far as the setup, we definitely have to prepare. similar as we did in the knowledge and skills. We have to conduct our session, and that's when you get into talking to people, figuring out what those job responsibilities are, defining the tasks, etc. And then the recommendation, which is similar to the report, we have to figure out the needs that are going to, or I'm sorry, the solutions that are going to help enhance that job or task depending on what we found. So it's very similar. We need to gather data, we need to analyze the data, and then we need to present a report. And before we depart from the job and task analysis, some points to note are that type of analysis is helpful to develop the workforce potential. People are doing fine, they are all okay, but if we do an analysis like that, sometimes we can find some potential in terms of what we need, what is the next type of worker that we're going to hire, etc. And so when we have also particularly high technical and specialized industries, that's also very important. Think about the engineering jobs like General Electric and the automotive industry that perhaps need that type of specialty of work or task. So now we're switching to the competency. And if you recall my initial example, so it's the ability, is the performance in which you do something. So going back to JC, our friend, so he needs to identify trends over time for those model points in data sets for each project. So how well does he do it? Because he needs to forecast trends and analyze drivers for those current trends. So at this point, we're no longer calculating central tendency measures, or we're asking him to use a tool. Now we're asking him to use critical thinking and then figure out what are those trends, right? So that's where the competency starts getting into it. So usually we use that needs analysis to identify management, supervisory, or professional job competencies. So what does it take to be a leader of this group? What does it take to be a professional expert on, or a senior expert on this role, etc. We also use it to create a template of sorts for recruiting. That could become the job description. For development, as a matter of fact, some development plans sometimes. You started as a novice in this role, now we want to take you to an expert level. So that can be definitely used for that. And also it helps us examine the competencies for a particular professional group across different organizations, cultures, or even countries. Because think about it, you can build automotive, you can work in the automotive industry, but I can almost guarantee you the assembly line is going to be different in the United States as it is going to be in China or in Asia or even in Europe. So because the language is different and the organization is different, etc. So there are a number of factors. So the competency-based needs assessment really is going to help us increase that quality of performance. So it's not necessarily going after the skills and knowledge, but it's going more as to how well something is performed, right? Best practices, etc. Some of the benefits helps us establish qualities and characteristics to distinguish performance. So that's when I was talking about the novice versus the intermediate versus the advanced or the professional, etc. It also helps us provide predictors of current or future performance depending on what we're looking at. So this is usually helpful when you are doing an assessment on performance improvement. You know, that helps us figure out, we have a person, that person is doing the job, but how well are they doing it? And do we want to have that person do the job even better, more exact, etc. So all of that is important. And then as far as some of the drawbacks, it's definitely time consuming. That is probably the biggest thing. And then of course it is cost prohibitive sometimes, because it's going to take you some logistics to assess the competency. Remember the example that I gave you before. When you have to have somebody assemble or disassemble something, it's going to take them some time, especially when you are requiring people to do something that takes real time. That's going to be longer, of course. Definitely the project management skills. And as far as some success factors, we definitely have to make sure that we're looking at competencies that are going to produce outcomes that are aligning with what the company is looking to do. We have to have sponsorship, And we definitely have to have ownership from the people that are doing it. Otherwise, they are going to be too slow to do it, sloppy work. So we're going to be assessing really something that is not correct. And as far as the process on how to set up the competency based, it's very similar. We still have to gather data, etc. But look at 5 components. So the first one is we have to develop a project plan, figure out what those parameters, who the key players are going to be, how we're going to assess it, conduct the behavior interviews. So usually you don't want to just do observations. You definitely want to talk to people, figure out what they are saying, etc. from a behavioral standpoint. Because remember, a person can be very good at doing something, but there's got to be a motivator behind it for them to do it well, even though may be good performers, but there is something that motivates them. So that's why we have to have behavioral interviews. And then we have to construct the competency model, and that's perhaps what you're going to find the hardest challenge is, because you have to define some competencies that definitely are going to get to the nitty-gritty of some of the tasks or some of the jobs, and there will be advocates in the company, in your space, that may be for or against it, and that's where you're going to find some resistance. Then you have to assess the gap, of course, that's the analysis, and then we have to implement the model. So the implementation of the model also requires a presentation, so it's very similar to the other needs assessments. And then the last one is our strategic needs assessment, as you heard me say before. So these goes beyond the person, this goes beyond the work they do and the skills they know. It really gets into the whole strategy. What do we need to achieve that strategy? But going back to our friend JC, he will use strengths and central tendency measures, which is something we've talked about him doing before, to feed the strategic team so they can decide best course of action for the business during a given fiscal period. So if you notice, is definitely what he's doing and how he's doing it has an impact on the strategy or the strategic direction of the company. And that's precisely why we have this assessment. If you remember on our time and effort, this is perhaps the highest one. It takes longer and it takes a lot of effort to do because it's going to take some time. You cannot observe something quickly. You have to look at the industry and a lot of other factors. So it is usually something defined as systematic approach for determining the needs of a business, a company or organization, whether it's a for-profit or not, a community, etc., and where they are going. So we use this one when we want to figure out the performance improvement or the going to the next level of a company or an organization or even a department. When we are taking a long-term performance improvement or challenge or initiative, and also when we perhaps want to compete against what is happening in our industry. So there are some benefits and some drawbacks of the strategic needs. So definitely the benefits helps for long-term solutions of the existing performance or problems that the company or the organization is suffering. And then of course it gets to the core of the business that is affecting it or enhancing it. And then it also talks about or deals with future performance issues. As the industry grows, what are we facing? Remember that every organization begins with something in mind. And as the business grows and evolves, the needs as well. And so that's why the strategic needs assessment is so important. As far as some of the drawbacks, as I was talking about, it is time intensive, very costly. It requires participation by many people, so that's why it takes some time too. And then it requires a lot of advanced organizational and development skills, because here's where you're poking the bear. People don't like when you look under the hood of a car because you know you're going to find problems. And some people don't like to be highlighted when problems arise, right? So these can be very political in nature. As far as the success factors, definitely we have to have that sponsorship. Remember, if we don't have buy-in from the people that we're going to go explore what is happening, they are not going to like us poking around. We definitely have to have access to customers, to managers, to the public in general. And then the company or the organization has to be ready for change, because usually when we do a needs assessment, we are going to find something that will require them to change. As far as the steps, it's very basic still. We need to gather information, analyze it, present it back into a report. But we have 5 components here. We have to gather the preliminary information. So what is it that people are saying? What does that point B look like? Is the organization being upset because of the industry changes, etc.? We have to examine the external environments and identify relevant opportunities and threats. So here's where we do a SWOT analysis, if you have ever heard about it: strengths, weaknesses, threats, and opportunities. We are no longer looking at what is in front of us. We have to look even outside, and that's why it takes some time. Sometimes it takes a long time to gather that data. But sometimes it's also good because we have access to some of that data, depending on the industry. We have to look at the internal environment too, and that's where it gets a little tricky. Remember when I was talking about poking the bear? So usually people don't like that, but that's where we have to be careful, and yet we have to do it. And then, of course, chart that future environment, and that's where that analysis comes into play. Do we want to pull this lever to get there? Do we want to sell more? Do we want to offer a different service? Do we want to offer a mixed service, etc.? And then we also have to develop performance improvement plans, access readiness for change, and select interventions or selective interventions. And that is nothing more than your report, but it definitely is a little more extensive. So in turn, we have those 4 approaches, and I hope you guys, even though we went a little quickly on those, you get an idea how each level is a little higher and it demands more from us. Thank you all.